No, well, I'll tell you the
Louise,
story
or
that's so hysterical.
Okay.
Like I met a guy in a bar who was the one I finally went hitchhiking with,
Mm-hmm.
and he was like a very minor boyfriend, but it was funny. Like I knew him for a few weeks casually, and then he made what amounted to a formal date, like I'll pick you up at thing. Okay. So I had set up an easel in the living room. There'd be no other room, really, except some kind of cross between a kitchen and a bedroom somewhere else with no light in it. And I was working that afternoon. And then, of course, I stopped and got dressed, and the bell rang, and I opened the door, and he looks at the easel, he looks at me, and said, "Whose is that?" And I said, "Mine." And he looked at me and said, "Oh, you really do paint, don't you?" And that was like the whole thing. I mean, there were all these people who weren't going to write something. As a matter of fact, this guy was supposed to be a writer, and he was probably less horrendous than the rest. And I remember once when I finally moved to Third Avenue, like a couple of years after I'd even seen him very much, his calling me up to tell me he was going back to Tennessee, where he may still be for all I know. And he was probably, you know, like less fraudulent than most of the other people I met. So when they talked about Provincetown, I thought, well, I know I'm going to hate it. Right. Anyway, I went away on this, you know, thing, and I hitchhiked out there either alone or with friends for about a month and fixed the place up. And then stayed there for about 6 weeks. And then my mother's birthday is in August. I think every Jewish mother was born in August. And except me, of course. But yes, not me. But I'm a different kind. Even though my children accuse me of being the standard kind, but not quite so bad. Anyhow, I thought, well, everyone's been talking about it so much. What I'll do is, I'll hitchhike up to Provincetown. I'll stay there 2 days. Then I'll hitchhike down to visit my mother on her birthday. Then I'll come back here to Pennsylvania. This was about 15 miles below Reading.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I hitchhiked up. I hit Provincetown. And that was it. I mean, that was
Been there
it.
ever since.
Well, in a sense.
Yeah.
And I just absolutely went ape. And I met some people I had known in the village, and I stayed with them. And then I went back to Pennsylvania, packed up a whole bunch of stuff, shipped it to Provincetown, and left some things there, which I picked up the following winter. And stayed for 3 months. I stayed like until November 10th, at which point I was completely broke, but also so cold in the place that I'd rented that I had to leave or I would have died. I mean, there were 2 nights I really went to sleep and wasn't sure I'd wake up, and I went to sleep fully clothed with every blanket in the house piled on top of me. But I think in some weird way, even though I don't think it happened at the time, just visually it's been very important to me, and I still love it. You know.
In what way do you mean visually important?
Well, there was kind of clarity of just colors and things. I mean, the realization of it took place much later, like 7 years later. But just in terms of the place, I absolutely fell madly in love with it. Like I entered on this sunshiny day with the tide out and the flats just sitting there and everything sparkling, and I thought, oh my God, this is it. Home at last. Because my knowledge of the ocean had been confined to something like Rockaway Beach, you know, when I was a child, and a few trips to Jones Beach or something like that as an adult. But I'd never seen like the ocean and this whole thing, and I just went absolutely out of my mind. And that summer I met like Wolf Kahn and Ibram Lassaw, and went to like Boris Margot's big fire thing that he used to do every Labor Day, which of course nobody can do anymore. Well, at the time everything was very fuzzy because I knew nothing about it, and I was just taken there by people. I mean, for a week, I hardly ever left the place where I was staying because I didn't know anything about it. And I was, you know, like I really didn't, I just knew from New Beach and the west end of town where I was staying and really didn't know anything very much about the whole scene in terms of what it meant as an artist or whatever you want to say, color, that whole scene. But I was taken to this thing, and I remember in those days, which was heavenly, they hadn't put Route 6 in yet. So walking from town to the dunes took about an hour. And it was unbelievable. Like I'd already been out there once with some friends and, you know, rolled up in blankets and spent the night there. And it was unbelievable. I also got poison ivy, which was unbelievable. You know, so that when I visited my mother finally, you know, my eyes were tight shut because I thought I had sun poisoning. It turned out to be the worst case of poison ivy I've ever had. Because we walked out at night and of course we couldn't see
where you were going.
I mean, it was moonlight. It was like being on the moon or something. It was incredible.
But what's this Boris Marcus
Well,
thing?
apparently every year until the national park took over, we couldn't even make a bonfire of any kind. And I didn't know him. Like I really hardly know him now. I just met him a couple of times. But every year he would have, it must have been Labor Day, but he would invite practically everyone who was interested. Like it was an open thing. Like, you know, when we went out, I think we went on foot, but we were passed by beach buggies. There were people streaming in from town. It was like a highway or something. And I think that night, like someone, you know, a car overturned on a dune and all kinds of stuff. But he would invite everyone out, and they would build this enormous construction on the beach. And at some point, they would set fire to it, and there'd be this huge fire, and people would recite poetry and play music and sing songs and a whole thing. And of course, I met a lot of people. And since I stayed there till November, I met a few of the people who stayed there, and actually some of them are still friends. And I had, at the end of the summer, I'd been living with someone who shall be totally nameless. Anyway, that became impossible. So I looked for a place, and by that time I'd been out on a fishing boat, and I'd met Manny Zora, the famous sea captain, you know, about whom is like a whole other myth in Provincetown. Not anymore, because the whole thing is really totally removed, you know, like nowhere. But he said he knew about this place, and it's just like my move now or even my move then. Like I've always gone further. It's like the place strikes me, like where I live is very important. And I had like no money to spend, but I had this ex-husband from whom I could borrow money, and my parents who occasionally would help me out, but couldn't really afford very much, and absolutely zilch money. So I was thinking in terms, which was possible in those days, of a place that was like $25 a month, which I could just afford because I'd borrowed some money to stay for a while. And he said, well, there's this place, but I think it might be more than you want. But he took me to what was the old Haymaker place, and that was like a haunted house kind of situation where there was this old lady and a kind of idiot, either daughter or niece. There were various stories that either it was her natural child or it was a sister's child, but in any case the girl was really in bad shape. And they all dressed very funny, like it was really strictly out of something else. And the top floor was for rent. And I went up those stairs, and that was it. It was $50 a month, but I didn't care. I mean, this place was unbelievable. It was enormous. It was filled with the wildest furniture, like marble-top dressers and a round music box and wicker furniture and an isinglass stove, kerosene stove. I mean, there was an ice man because there was an ice box, right? And it had 2 bedrooms, which didn't matter because I was just by myself at that point. But this huge space, it wasn't the greatest place to work, but it had windows like all around. It was just unbelievable. It's now been, I mean, it's still an apartment, but it's like the grounds, which were wild because they were unkempt, but fantastic, and on top of Bradford Street, like right at the top of that hill. Overlooked the bay and the whole thing, and then huge windows on the west, and I've always been a sunset freak. Or maybe that's how I became a sunset freak, I really don't remember. But, you know, obviously I couldn't work after a certain point when the sun started going down because everything turned red and orange. But it was absolutely marvelous until it became too cold. And there were lots of stories involved with that.
Yeah.
Not crucial to my work, but
Yeah.
you know, I worked.
Now, you've had some shows in Provincetown, right?
Oh, many.
And how are they? I've often wondered, Carlos and various people who do exhibitions up there. Do they sell things? Is it just for the artist? Or,
no, I mean, the whole scene is so completely different than it was, say, 10 years ago, that it's really kind of depressing. I didn't show it all this year. Well, I did. There was a show at Carlos's of women artists early in the season. He invited me to that. But in general, it's really pathetic because when I first went up, the first year, the guy who had the jewelry shop showed a few paintings, like it wasn't a complete thing. It wasn't a gallery. But he did that summer, or the next summer, I think it was the next summer, 53, show, I think, Wolf Kahn and Lester Johnson and Gandhi Brody. And I think that was about it, because it wasn't really a gallery.
No.
And I don't know when the Sun Gallery opened, but that was the most vital, because that's where Red showed first. That's where I first showed, at all in Provincetown. And they showed all the young artists.
Who ran that again?
Yvonne Anderson and Val Falcone. He was a poet, and she was a painter, but now she's done that Yellow Ball workshop, which has become unbelievably successful. I mean, she spends more time traveling around. Well, it started out by her, I think, running, I don't know if she worked for a school system, because they moved to Everett, Massachusetts. And I don't know if she had a group privately, that started with her own kids. Like her daughter is just Kate's age, and the boy is about 2 or 3 years older. And they did sort of cartoon animation film. And it became like a whole thing. I mean, she travels like all over the place, setting up this kind of program and telling people how to run it. And she showed some films in Provincetown a few years ago. And she's really good. But when they had the gallery, it was really exciting because it was the only place the young artists could show. I think Coots opened up there for a while, and then Nat Halpert took over when he copped out. And there were a number of galleries that, then it exploded like around 1958, and there were, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 or 10 galleries all over town.
But did anybody ever sell anything in the summer?
Oh, sure.
Who bought things?
Well, during 58, when Chrysler opened up his things, it was like another Monopoly game in which I didn't participate, unfortunately. But I remember there was a guy that I was seeing, and I went out to the store to get some groceries, and when I came back, he'd sold, like, I don't know how many $1,000s worth of paintings. Like, one of the collectors had come in and bought something in the 20 minutes I was gone. And it was like that for about 2 or 3 years. Like, it was just an explosion. And people bought, even I sold a few things, but not much. But there was just an enormous explosion. And some people who know more about than I do say that when there was a particular hotel that was run on very old grand lines, then there was no place much that collectors wanted to stay. And maybe the scene was so strong in New York by that time that they didn't need it or whatever, but gradually it disappeared into almost nothingness. So there is a market for a certain kind of thing. Carlos apparently did very well because it's the first year, of course, that he's run it himself since Teresa died last November. He was sort of freaking out, but he sold sort of odd things, like not the people he used to sell well did not sell, and then he sold kind of odd things, but apparently did very well. I don't think it could have all been sympathy sales. Money all the same.
One of the things that you did, as I guess everybody has done, is the teaching circuit. One school after another kind of thing.
That
what started that?
Really true.
No, well, I mean, but you've been to various.
Only recently.
Yeah, but when did that
The
start?
very first thing I did was a visiting artist thing, I think in 1964, because someone that I knew in Provincetown, Tony Beavers. Have you ever been to Provincetown?
No.
Really?
No.
Never? You poor darling.
I keep putting it off.
Go up to Christmas.
Oh.
Anyhow, he went out to teach at Purdue.
Right.
And he invited me out for what amounted to, I think, 2.5 days or something.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the very first thing I did.